Penguin Random House Audio presents The Quiet Americans, 4 CIA Spies at the Dawn of the Cold War, a tragedy in 3 acts, by Scott Anderson, read for you by Robertson Dean. Author's note and preface read by the author.
This book is dedicated to the memory of my sister, Tina Furmanek, and of my brother-in-arms, Commander John Krostevats. Author's note. The Soviet Union's principal state security agency underwent nearly a dozen name changes during its 74-year history, but was best known by 2 successive acronyms, the NKVD, or People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, and the KGB, or Committee for State Security. In the interest of clarity, I have followed the example of most Cold War historians and adopted KGB as the primary acronym for most of the period covered in this book. Somewhat more complicated is the usage of the acronyms OPC for Office of Policy Coordination and CIA. For the first 2 years of its existence, from 1948 to 1950, OPC was regarded as quite separate from the CIA, even though it was housed within the agency. This distinction blurred as the 2 organizations began to be integrated in late 1950 and disappeared altogether with their full merger in 1952. The end result, however, is that the same speakers or writers who might describe the OPC and CIA as 2 wholly separate and often adversarial bodies during the earlier period will then use the acronyms interchangeably when referring to events in the later integrated period. I have attempted to delineate this changing relationship where necessary within the text, but some confusion might persist, as indeed it did for employees of both offices at the time. This is the author, Scott Anderson. Preface. When I was a very young boy, my favorite day of the year was October 10th. It was the mid-1960s, and my family and I were living in Taiwan, where my father was attached to the American Embassy. October 10th was the anniversary of an uprising in 1911 that led to the creation of the Republic of China, and it was celebrated in Taiwan by a massive military parade through the streets of the capital, Taipei. By great good luck, my father's office overlooked one of the main parade routes, as well as the vast square in front of the presidential palace that was the marchers' final destination. From his office window, I would watch transfixed as the square below gradually filled with soldiers wearing a riotous array of different colored uniforms and standing at rigid attention. The highlight was when Chiang Kai-shek emerged onto a balcony of the palace to give a speech. It always ended with the same exhortation, back to the mainland. At this, artillery would thunder, 100,000 soldiers cheered as one, and great billows of propaganda balloons and homing pigeons carrying anti-communist messages rose into the sky, theoretically on their way to the enemy, Red China, just 80 miles away across the Formosa Strait. For a bloody-minded young boy, all of this was terrific stuff, better than Christmas. It took me a long time to realize that my father didn't actually enjoy these annual outings. Like everyone else of my generation, my view of the world was fundamentally shaped by the Cold War. This shaping may have been more acute in my case due to the places where I grew up: South Korea, Taiwan, and Indonesia. Korea and Taiwan were both regarded as frontline states in the Cold War, while by the time my family moved there, Indonesia was just emerging from a Cold War-inspired mass bloodletting that left at least 500,000 dead. One of the things I remember most from my childhood is that the threat of war, of a sudden attack by the communists, was always in the air. In South Korea, the government ruled under martial law, its army forever vigilant against the North Korean communists, massed just 35 miles up the road from the capital of Seoul. In Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek went one better than martial law and declared a permanent state of siege. The entranceway to my elementary school was dominated by a large anti-aircraft gun on a swivel platform, 2 Republic of China soldiers constantly scanning the skies with binoculars for first sign of an incoming Red Chinese squadron. The result in both countries was soldiers everywhere, in the marketplaces, in the parks, passing by in long convoys of transport trucks during school field trips or family drives. Whenever I conjure an image from my childhood, there are usually soldiers somewhere in the frame. I was alternately thrilled and terrified by all this. Once in Taiwan, when in the grip of the latter state of mind, when I couldn't sleep at night for fear that the communists might come before morning, I sought reassurance from my godfather, a tough-as-nails lieutenant colonel in Air Force intelligence. When I asked how much advance warning we would have if the Red Chinese did attack, my godfather lit one of the 60 or 70 camels he would smoke that day and gazed thoughtfully up at its coil of smoke. "About 9 minutes," he said finally. "Why do you ask?" I was too young to appreciate the cynicism of all this, to understand that much of what I was seeing was just so much political theater. The North Koreans weren't going to stream across the DMZ again, and the Red Chinese weren't going to invade Taiwan. By the 1960s, the East Asia front of the Cold War had long since settled into watchful stasis. Instead, what upholding the banner of anti-communism now meant in these places was that their military dictators need brook no opposition, could summarily crush even the slightest sign of domestic dissent. And so they did. In April 1960, my parents watched from a hillside above downtown Seoul as students protesting the dictatorship were machine-gunned by police. During the time we lived in Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek's prisons were filled to bursting with tens of thousands of political prisoners. In the so-called Indonesian Civil War, virtually all the killing had been done by one side, all the dying by the other. And rather than the advertised communist conspirators, the vigilante squads set loose by the military junta often found their victims among Indonesia's ethnic Chinese minority, the backbone of the nation's merchant class. In each one of these countries, the dictator's chief benefactor, the United States, could be counted on to steadfastly look the other way. One reason I didn't grasp much of this at the time was because my parents didn't talk about it. Part of their reticence undoubtedly derived from their not wanting one of their children to blurt out an inconvenient truth at an inconvenient moment. But I'm sure another part stemmed from the fact that my father was part of the apparatus that kept these regimes in place. It must have been a strange and confusing experience for him. A farm boy from Fresno, California, a lifelong yellow dog Democrat with a hint of the socialist about him. But this too was something we never really discussed. But perhaps it wasn't strange or confusing for him at all. By the 1960s, my father had been witness to a sweeping red advance across the globe over the previous 2 decades. His liberal leanings aside, like virtually all Americans, he regarded communism as an enslaving force, a cancer to be resisted. By virtue of his work with the American government, he was an agricultural advisor for the Agency for International Development, or AID, and the frontline postings he was given, he had the opportunity to personally engage in that struggle. I'm fairly certain he was not an intelligence officer, but like many American government employees posted abroad in the 1950s and 1960s, he often did double duty. In his soft power role with AID, he assisted in agrarian reform schemes in a number of countries in Central America and East Asia, and distributed American emergency aid in the wake of natural disasters. Noble work that also fit in nicely with the hearts and minds' efforts to steer the rural poor away from communism. In his more hard power role, my father also helped create rural paramilitary and home guard formations designed to watch for the unrest of leftist agitators and to monitor the political views of the local population. As often happens with such vigilante networks, most of those fostered by AID in the 1950s and 1960s ultimately proved more effective as vehicles for personal vendettas and score settling than ideological policing. And certainly the fate of anyone denounced for their purported leftist views in places like South Korea and Taiwan couldn't have been a pleasant one. Where it all truly began to turn, both for myself and my father, was with the Vietnam War. By 1966, and accelerating through 1968, Taiwan became both a back base and an R&R destination for soldiers serving in Vietnam. The streets of Taipei now filled with even more uniforms. Moving into our small American housing enclave above the city were the families of American officers stationed in Saigon, and the free-ranging game of cowboys and Indians that we boys in the neighborhood had previously played was renamed Green Berets and Viet Cong. It didn't actually change the game that much, except that in the past, the Indians sometimes won, and in the new version, the Viet Cong.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?